You wake up with a tight chest, a restless body, a sense that something is wrong, yet nothing is happening. No threat, no danger, no clear reason. This is precisely where anxiety reveals its most deceptive form. I observed long ago that fear does not always announce itself with a name. Sometimes it survives the loss of its origin. Anxiety without an object is not irrational. It is memory without language. The mind has forgotten what frightened it, but the nervous system has not. The body reacts as if danger were imminent because, once upon a time, it was. What you feel now is not about the present moment. It is the echo of an earlier alarm that was never consciously understood or resolved. In my work, I learned that fear can be separated from its cause and continue to exist independently, like smoke without visible fire. When the original threat becomes too painful, too confusing, or too forbidden to recognize, the psyche performs a quiet operation. It removes the object and leaves the sensation. The fear remains active, but it no longer points anywhere. This is why you search your life for explanations and find none. Anxiety of this kind does not arise from current circumstances. It arises from a psychic wound that has been sealed over, not healed. The seal holds memory down, but pressure still builds beneath it. The mind believes it has moved on, because consciousness is calm. But the unconscious does not follow such timelines. It preserves emotional truths even when factual memory dissolves. Anxiety without an object is the unconscious insisting on being heard without knowing how to speak. It does not say, "This happened," or "This person hurt you." Instead, it says, "Be alert, something is wrong, you are not safe," even when no danger is visible. This creates the torment of modern anxiety, constant vigilance without explanation, tension without story, fear without a face. Many patients asked me why their anxiety appeared during moments of peace rather than crisis. The answer is simple and unsettling. When external danger disappears, internal danger becomes louder. Silence gives space for buried material to stir. Anxiety emerges not because life is falling apart, but because the mind finally has enough quiet to sense what it has been avoiding. The absence of chaos removes distraction. What remains is the unresolved emotional residue of earlier experiences that were never allowed full expression or understanding. This form of anxiety often originates in early life, when fear could not be named, resisted, or escaped. A child does not possess the psychological tools to interpret threat. It only absorbs sensation. Later, as an adult, the memory of the event may vanish, but the bodily reaction persists. The chest tightens, breathing shortens, muscles prepare for flight, yet the mind finds no enemy. The adult feels confused by their own response, unaware that they are reacting perfectly to a danger their consciousness no longer recalls. What troubles people most is not the fear itself, but its meaninglessness. Humans can endure fear when it has purpose. Anxiety without an object feels like betrayal by one's own mind. But there is no betrayal here, only miscommunication. The unconscious speaks in sensations, not explanations. It does not reason, it signals. Anxiety is not asking you to fix the present moment. It is pointing towards something unresolved that has never been mentally integrated into your story of yourself. This is why reassurance fails. Telling yourself that everything is fine addresses consciousness, not the source. The unconscious does not respond to logic, it responds to recognition. Until the buried fear is allowed form, language, and meaning, it continues to roam freely, attaching itself to nothing and everything. Anxiety without an object persists precisely because it has nowhere to land. It is fear in search of its forgotten name. As we move forward, It becomes necessary to understand what happens when this nameless fear presses against the mind's defenses, and how repression keeps it alive rather than eliminating it. Anxiety does not exist in isolation. It is sustained by the very mechanisms meant to contain it, quietly shaping how the psyche protects itself from what it still cannot face. You may believe your thoughts are calm, reasonable, even balanced, yet anxiety rises anyway, without invitation or explanation. This is not a contradiction, it is a division. I learned that the mind can appear peaceful while conflict rages beneath it. Conscious thought is not the whole psyche. It is only the surface. Beneath it, opposing desires can coexist in silence, each denied expression, each demanding satisfaction. Anxiety emerges at the exact point where these forces collide without resolution. What feels like sudden tension is in fact prolonged inner struggle, finally producing pressure strong enough to be felt. I observed that many individuals live with a carefully maintained sense of rational control. They explain their choices logically, behave appropriately, and avoid extremes. Yet this composure often masks a deeper conflict between what one wants and what one believes one is allowed to want. Desire does not disappear when forbidden. It retreats. And when it retreats, it does not become harmless. It remains active, pressing against restraint. Anxiety is the signal produced when incompatible demands occupy the same psychic space without conscious negotiation. This conflict is rarely dramatic or obvious. It does not announce itself as a clear wish versus a clear rule. More often, it is subtle. The desire to rest conflicting with the demand to perform, the wish to express anger colliding with the need to remain agreeable, the longing for closeness restrained by fear of dependence. Each force alone seems manageable. Together, they generate tension with no visible cause. Anxiety appears because the psyche cannot decide which impulse deserves expression without threatening the stability of the self. The ego attempts to maintain order by keeping this conflict out of awareness. It does so skillfully, convincing the individual that nothing is wrong. But repression is not resolution. The unconscious continues to register contradiction even when consciousness denies it. Anxiety arises precisely at the moment when repression succeeds too well. When conflict cannot be thought, it must be felt. The body becomes the stage on which unresolved opposition performs its drama through tension, restlessness, and unease. Many people assume anxiety means weakness or irrationality. In truth, it often reflects excessive control. The more rigidly the ego polices thought and feeling, the more forcefully conflict seeks another route of expression. Calm thoughts do not guarantee inner harmony. They may indicate avoidance. Anxiety, then, is not the enemy of reason. It is the consequence of reason being used as a shield against emotion rather than a bridge to it. I frequently saw patients who insisted they were content with their lives while their bodies told a different story. Their anxiety intensified precisely when nothing external seemed wrong. This occurs because inner conflict becomes most noticeable when external distraction fades. The psyche seizes quiet moments to push unresolved tensions upward. Anxiety surfaces not because danger is present, but because opposition has gone unheard for too long. What makes this form of anxiety particularly disturbing is its invisibility. There is no single thought to challenge, no belief to correct. The source is structural, not situational. It lies in the organization of the psyche itself, where incompatible wishes have been forced into silence rather than brought into dialogue. Until they are acknowledged, anxiety remains the only available language through which conflict can announce its existence. This leads us naturally to consider what happens when repression does not merely silence conflict, but allows it to return in distorted form, resurfacing through sudden emotional reactions that feel out of proportion. Anxiety is not only sustained by repression, It is shaped by what repression inevitably allows to return. You may search your thoughts for a cause, yet anxiety announces itself first in the body: a tight chest, restless limbs, shallow breath, a sense of threat without an image. I came to understand that the psyche does not store all experience in words. Much of what is lived, especially early in life, is registered somatically before language exists. When the mind forgets, the body remembers. Anxiety often emerges not as an idea, but as a sensation, because the original experience was never symbolized, never translated into thought, only endured. In early childhood, the nervous system learns before the intellect does. Fear, separation, helplessness, and overstimulation leave traces long before the ego can name them. These impressions do not vanish with maturity. They persist as bodily dispositions, patterns of tension and readiness that reactivate when the present echoes the past. When anxiety feels purely physical, it is often because its origin belongs to a time when words were unavailable and the body became the sole archive of experience. The adult mind may insist that nothing threatening is happening, yet the body responds as if danger were imminent. This contradiction is not irrational, it is historical. The body reacts to familiar emotional conditions, not objective reality. A tone of voice, a pause, a certain kind of closeness or distance can awaken ancient physiological responses. Anxiety appears because the body recognizes something the conscious mind does not remember living through, only surviving. I observed that many patients felt betrayed by their own bodies. They would say, "I know I'm safe, but I don't feel safe." This division reveals the limits of conscious reassurance. The body does not respond to logic. It responds to memory encoded as sensation. When anxiety bypasses thought, it indicates that the experience shaping it occurred prior to reflection, prior to narrative, and therefore cannot be calmed by reasoning alone. These bodily memories are not static. They seek discharge, expression, and recognition. When denied a psychological pathway, they manifest as chronic tension, fatigue, panic, or vague unease. The body becomes the messenger for what the psyche has not yet integrated. Anxiety, in this sense, is not a malfunction, but a communication attempt, carrying emotional information that has never been mentally processed. This is why anxiety so often intensifies in moments of stillness. When external demands quiet down, the body finally has space to speak. Sensations rise because they are no longer drowned out by activity or distraction. The individual experiences this as anxiety coming out of nowhere, when in truth it emerges precisely because the psyche is no longer actively suppressing its own signals. The ego frequently attempts to regain control by tightening further, monitoring symptoms, resisting sensations, demanding calm. Yet this struggle only reinforces the division between mind and body. The more the ego treats anxiety as an intruder, the more insistently the body repeats its message. What has not been symbolized cannot be dismissed. It must be translated. This brings us to a deeper problem. When bodily anxiety persists, it often points not only to forgotten experiences, but to unresolved meanings. The body remembers, but it remembers without understanding. Anxiety continues until these sensations are given psychic form, until what was once only felt can finally be thought, named, and connected to the inner conflicts that still shape the individual's emotional life. There is a particular form of anxiety that troubles people most deeply because it offers no clear target. Nothing specific seems wrong. No identifiable threat presents itself, yet the feeling of danger persists. I describe this state as free-floating anxiety, fear that has been detached from its original object and now circulates freely within the psyche. When fear loses its direction, it does not disappear. It becomes omnipresent, staining every moment with a vague sense of unease. In such cases, the mind searches desperately for explanations. The individual scans their life, their relationships, their responsibilities, hoping to locate the source of discomfort. But this search often fails because the anxiety no longer belongs to the present situation. Its origin lies elsewhere, in conflicts that were never resolved but merely displaced. What was once fear of something has become fear itself, unbound, and therefore harder to escape. I observed that when the psyche cannot tolerate a specific fear, it may strip that fear of its object. This is a defensive maneuver. It is sometimes easier to feel anxious about nothing than to confront a truth that would threaten the ego's stability. By removing the object, the mind avoids facing the original conflict, but pays the price of constant tension. Anxiety becomes chronic precisely because it lacks a destination. This form of anxiety often creates the illusion that the world itself is unsafe. The individual begins to anticipate danger everywhere, even in neutral or pleasant situations. This is not paranoia, but a misattribution. The internal state of fear is projected outward, coloring perception. When fear has no anchor inside, it attaches itself loosely to everything outside, producing a continuous background of alertness and fatigue. Free-floating anxiety also exhausts the ego. Without a specific problem to solve, the ego remains in a state of readiness, unable to discharge tension through action or understanding. The individual feels restless yet paralyzed, vigilant yet powerless. This condition drains psychic energy, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming, not because they are difficult, but because the mind is already burdened by unnamed fear. I would caution against the belief that clarity alone can resolve this anxiety. Insight is necessary, but it must be the right insight. Naming random stressors does little if they are not truly connected to the emotional source. Free-floating anxiety demands not distraction, but investigation, a willingness to trace fear backward, away from the present, toward the internal conflicts that first generated it. Often, this anxiety intensifies during periods of relative calm. When external pressures decrease, the psyche loses its usual outlets for displacement. Fear, no longer tied to work, crisis, or urgency, reveals itself in its raw form. This leads many to believe that relaxation causes anxiety, when in fact relaxation simply removes the cover that was keeping it hidden. As fear remains without direction, it quietly prepares the ground for other defenses to emerge. Compulsions, irritability, avoidance, or constant mental activity. These behaviors attempt to give shape to the anxiety, to contain it by any means available. But until the original conflict is faced and given meaning, fear will continue to wander freely, seeking an anchor it was never allowed to keep. There is a form of anxiety that does not come from danger in the world, but from judgment within the mind itself. I identified this source as the superego, the internal authority formed from parental commands, social rules, and moral expectations. Even when a person believes they are doing nothing wrong, this inner voice may still exert pressure, creating a persistent sense of tension without conscious accusation. The superego does not need to speak loudly to be effective. In fact, its most powerful influence is often silent. It manifests not as clear thoughts of guilt, but as a vague feeling of being inadequate, behind, or somehow failing. The individual feels watched and evaluated, yet cannot point to a specific charge. Anxiety emerges because the ego senses judgment, but cannot negotiate with it. I observed that many people experience anxiety precisely when they are resting, enjoying themselves, or doing nothing productive. This is no coincidence. For a strict superego, pleasure itself can feel suspicious. Calm becomes dangerous because it removes external justification for self-approval. The individual may unconsciously feel they have not earned rest, safety, or satisfaction, and anxiety fills the gap. This internal pressure often develops early, especially in environments where love was conditional, when affection depended on performance, obedience, or emotional restraint. The child internalized these demands as absolute rules. Later in life, the adult may feel anxious not because they have failed, but because they fear they might fail, or worse, that they are failing without realizing it. Unlike fear, which reacts to threat, superego-driven anxiety reacts to evaluation. It is the tension of being measured against an internal ideal that is often unreachable. The ego struggles endlessly to satisfy this ideal, yet never receives confirmation that it has succeeded. Anxiety persists because the trial never officially ends. This explains why reassurance from others often has little effect. External praise cannot easily silence an internal judge. The superego does not respond to logic or evidence. It responds to deeply rooted emotional standards. The person may intellectually know they are doing fine, yet emotionally feel under constant scrutiny, as if something essential is always missing. Over time, this silent pressure can shape a person's entire way of being. They may become perfectionistic, hyper-responsible, or endlessly self-monitoring. Anxiety then becomes a background state, not tied to specific events, but to existence itself. Simply being alive feels like a task that must be justified. When this form of anxiety remains unrecognized, it often merges with the free-floating fear already present in the psyche. The individual senses danger without a source and judgment without a crime. These forces intertwine, reinforcing one another and preparing the ground for the next layer of anxiety, one that emerges not from rules or fear alone, but from the body and memory acting where the mind no longer dares to look. I have long observed that desire does not obey prohibition. When an impulse is judged unacceptable, by parents, by society, or later by one's own internal authority, it is not destroyed. It is only silenced. What is pushed out of awareness does not vanish. It descends into the unconscious, where it continues to seek expression. Anxiety often begins precisely here, at the point where a desire exists but has been denied the right to appear in conscious life. In many individuals, this denial happens early. A wish is felt, followed immediately by fear, shame, or punishment. The psyche learns a dangerous lesson. Wanting is unsafe. From that moment on, the ego attempts to protect itself, not by resolving the desire, but by burying it. Yet the emotional energy attached to that wish remains intact. It cannot be erased, it must be managed. Anxiety becomes one of the ego's preferred tools for containing this forbidden force. When I speak of anxiety in such cases, I do not mean fear of a specific object. I refer to a diffuse tension, a restless anticipation without a clear target. This form of anxiety emerges when desire presses upward from the unconscious, while the ego simultaneously works to keep it suppressed. The individual feels disturbed without knowing why, as if something within were demanding attention but refusing to reveal its name. The body often becomes the stage where this conflict plays out. The heart accelerates, breathing shortens, muscles tighten, not because the world is dangerous, but because the psyche is divided against itself. One part longs, another forbids. The anxiety is the compromise. The desire is not fulfilled, but neither is it allowed to die. Instead, it circulates endlessly as tension. What makes this process particularly exhausting is that the person often believes they are calm, reasonable, and in control. Conscious thought may feel neutral, even rational. Yet beneath this surface, the forbidden desire continues to move, like pressure building behind a sealed door. Anxiety becomes the signal of this pressure, a warning that repression is active, not that danger is present. I have seen patients who feared their anxiety more than the desires that produced it. They sensed that if the anxiety were to disappear, something uncontrollable might take its place. In truth, the anxiety already is that desire, transformed into a shape the ego believes it can survive. It is safer to feel vaguely afraid than to clearly want what once felt forbidden. Over time, this arrangement drains vitality. A life lived against one's own impulses becomes cautious, restrained, emotionally muted. The individual may function well, appear successful, even admirable, yet feel constantly on edge, as though something essential were missing. That missing element is not peace, it is permission. Permission to acknowledge what was once disallowed. As this tension continues, it quietly prepares the ground for the next layer of anxiety. When desire is repeatedly denied, the psyche begins to fear not only the impulse itself, but the possibility of losing control altogether. From here, anxiety no longer guards a single forbidden wish. It becomes a constant sentinel, watching over an inner world it no longer fully understands. I've often emphasized that the psyche does not experience time in the way the conscious mind believes it does. What was once felt intensely in childhood does not remain neatly in the past. It becomes embedded in the structure of the unconscious. When anxiety appears in adulthood without a clear reason, it is often because an early fear pattern has been silently reactivated. The individual feels threatened, not by the present situation itself, but by what it unconsciously resembles. In early life, the child lacks the psychological tools to fully understand danger, loss, or emotional instability. Fear is experienced directly, without explanation or language. These early emotional reactions leave deep impressions, especially when the child feels helpless, overwhelmed, or unsupported. Such moments do not disappear as memory fades. They are preserved as emotional templates that can be reawakened later. In adulthood, situations may arise that outwardly seem harmless. A conversation, a responsibility, a relationship dynamic, yet inwardly provoke intense anxiety. This happens because the unconscious recognizes a familiar emotional pattern. The present moment echoes an earlier experience, even if the conscious mind cannot identify the connection. The anxiety belongs less to now than to then. The individual may insist that nothing threatening is happening, and from a rational standpoint this is often true. Yet anxiety does not answer to logic. It answers to memory that was never fully processed. When the unconscious detects a resemblance, a similar tone of voice, a comparable feeling of abandonment, a sense of pressure, it responds as it once did, activating fear without explanation. I have observed that this reactivation often occurs during periods of transition or vulnerability. New roles, intimate relationships, or situations involving authority can awaken early experiences of dependency, rejection, or powerlessness. The adult ego believes it is reacting to the present, while the unconscious is reliving an unresolved emotional situation from childhood. What intensifies this anxiety is the confusion it creates. The person feels childish emotions within an adult body, which produces shame, frustration, or self-judgment. They may ask themselves why they are reacting so strongly, why they feel small, unsafe, or overwhelmed when no visible danger exists. This confusion further strengthens anxiety as the ego struggles to regain control. These early fear patterns persist precisely because they were never fully understood when they first appeared. The child endured them without the capacity to make sense of them. In adulthood, anxiety becomes the signal that these experiences are still seeking recognition. The fear is not irrational. It is simply out of context, disconnected from its original source. As these patterns continue to surface, anxiety becomes a bridge between past and present. It is the psyche's way of insisting that unfinished emotional work still exists, and as this pressure builds, the ego increasingly turns to control, judgment, and vigilance, setting the stage for the silent authority of the superego to intensify its grip on the inner life. I've often observed that the need for control rarely arises from strength. It emerges from fear. When the inner world feels unstable, the ego responds by tightening its grip. Order, routine, discipline, and constant self-monitoring become strategies to prevent something unknown from breaking through. Anxiety, in such cases, is not the result of chaos itself, but of the effort required to keep chaos at bay. The ego believes that if it remains vigilant enough, nothing dangerous will surface. Thoughts are filtered, impulses are restrained, emotions are moderated before they can be fully felt. This continuous regulation creates the appearance of calm, yet beneath it, tension accumulates. The psyche becomes like a sealed container under pressure, where every act of control adds another layer of compression. What is often misunderstood is that control does not eliminate unconscious material. It only delays its expression. The more forcefully the ego suppresses impulses, fears, or desires, the more energy is required to maintain this suppression. Anxiety emerges as the cost of this effort. It is the body's response to psychological overwork, signaling that the ego is carrying more than it can comfortably manage. Individuals who rely heavily on control often describe themselves as responsible, composed, or highly functional. They may take pride in their discipline and emotional restraint. Yet this rigidity leaves little room for spontaneity or emotional movement. When life presents unpredictability, a change, a loss, an unexpected emotion, anxiety flares, not because the event is dangerous, but because it threatens the ego's fragile equilibrium. I have seen patients who feared relaxation more than stress. Letting go, even briefly, felt intolerable, as if something terrible would happen if control were loosened. This fear reveals the true function of control. It is a defense against inner chaos that the individual does not trust themselves to face. Anxiety becomes the alarm that sounds whenever this defense weakens. The body participates fully in this struggle. Muscles remain tense, breathing shallow, attention hyper-focused. These physical states are not signs of readiness, but of sustained psychological restraint. The organism is never allowed to rest, because rest would mean allowing unconscious material to move freely. Anxiety persists as the price paid for constant containment. Over time, control becomes exhausting. The ego grows fatigued, yet feels unable to relinquish its role. This exhaustion often deepens anxiety rather than relieving it, creating a cycle in which tension produces more control, and more control produces greater tension. The individual may feel trapped by their own strategies for safety. As this pattern continues, anxiety no longer points to a specific fear or conflict. It becomes a background condition of life, a constant vigilance against an undefined threat. And it is from this state of chronic restraint that the psyche begins to confront a more severe authority within. The internal voice that demands perfection, obedience, and constant self-surveillance, tightening the internal conflict even further. I have long maintained that emotion is never destroyed. It only changes direction. When anger, grief, longing, or desire are not allowed to be expressed, their psychic energy does not disappear. It becomes displaced. Anxiety, in many cases, is the result of this displacement. Emotion stripped of its original object and redirected inward, where it can no longer be clearly recognized. In a healthy psychic process, emotion moves toward something: a person, a memory, a loss, a wish. But when expression feels dangerous or forbidden, the ego intervenes. It prevents the emotion from attaching itself to its true source. The feeling remains alive, but without a name or destination, Anxiety emerges as this free-floating emotional energy, searching for release. This is why anxiety often feels excessive or inappropriate to the situation at hand. The present moment is not the true cause. The emotional intensity belongs to something else, something that could not be felt at the time it arose. The individual experiences fear, tension, or dread without knowing what they are reacting to, because the original emotion has been disconnected from consciousness. I have observed this process frequently in those who were discouraged from expressing anger or sadness early in life. The child learns that certain feelings are unacceptable, that expressing them risks rejection or punishment. As an adult, the emotional impulse still arises, but the pathway for expression has been blocked. Anxiety becomes the compromise. The emotion exists, but in a distorted and unrecognizable form. The body again becomes the messenger. The displaced energy seeks an outlet through restlessness, tightness, nausea, racing thoughts, or a sense of impending threat. These sensations are not random. They are the somatic expressions of emotions that were never allowed to complete their natural course. Anxiety speaks where emotion was silenced. What makes this condition persistent is the ego's misunderstanding of the signal. Instead of asking what emotion is being avoided, the individual attempts to eliminate the anxiety itself. They seek calm, reassurance, or control, while the underlying emotional energy continues to circulate unresolved. This effort often intensifies anxiety, as the true source remains untouched. Anxiety, in this sense, is not an enemy of the psyche, but a distorted messenger. It carries information about emotional life that has been disorganized by repression. The more the individual attempts to suppress anxiety without addressing the underlying emotions, the louder and more insistent it becomes. As this displaced energy accumulates, the psyche begins to search for meaning. Anxiety starts to feel less like a reaction and more like a question, an unanswered demand from within. It is here that anxiety prepares the ground for a final shift, not toward control or avoidance, but toward understanding the message it has been carrying all along. I never regarded anxiety as a defect of the mind, nor as a failure of emotional regulation. Anxiety is purposeful. It is a signal, an internal alarm that alerts the ego to pressure arising from within the unconscious. When anxiety appears, something that has been pushed aside is demanding recognition, and the psyche is announcing that its balance is being threatened. This signal often emerges before conscious understanding is possible. The ego senses danger, but not from the external world. The danger comes from repressed wishes, unresolved conflicts, or emotions that are approaching awareness. Anxiety warns the ego that its usual defenses may no longer be sufficient to keep this material contained. Many people attempt to silence anxiety as quickly as possible. They treat it as an error, a malfunction, to be eliminated. In doing so, they miss its meaning. Anxiety does not appear without reason. It appears when the unconscious is active, when something essential is pressing upward and seeking integration into conscious life. I observed that anxiety frequently arises at moments of psychological transition. When old defenses weaken, when identity begins to shift, or when long-avoided emotions come close to awareness, anxiety intensifies. It is not the enemy of change. It is the accompaniment of it. The psyche resists transformation, and anxiety marks this resistance. The form anxiety takes depends on what is being defended against. Sometimes it appears as fear, sometimes as restlessness, sometimes as bodily tension or intrusive thoughts. These variations reflect the nature of the unconscious material attempting to emerge. Anxiety is the ego's response to this internal pressure, not its cause. When anxiety is misunderstood, it leads to further repression. The ego tightens its defenses, attempting to restore stability, But this only increases internal tension. When anxiety is approached with curiosity rather than fear, it becomes possible to trace it back to its source. Understanding reduces the need for constant vigilance. In analysis, anxiety often diminishes, not because it is suppressed, but because it is understood. When the individual recognizes what the anxiety is signaling, a desire, a loss, a fear, a conflict, the ego no longer needs to maintain the same level of defense, meaning replaces alarm. Thus, anxiety is not a sign that something is broken. It is evidence that something within is alive and seeking acknowledgement. It points toward unfinished psychological work, toward emotions and truths waiting to be faced. And when these signals are finally heard, anxiety no longer needs to shout. It has fulfilled its function.